Sometime before dawn, in a wooden house on the Russian plain, a woman lifts the lid off a clay pot that has never been allowed to go cold. Inside is a grey bubbling paste of rye flour and water, sharp and sour, smelling faintly of vinegar and apples. She stirs in fresh flour and a little warm water, the way her mother showed her, and her mother's mother before that. She does this before the fire, before the animals, before anything, because if this pot dies, the family does not eat bread. The Russians had a word for the thing in that pot, Zakvaska, a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria that turned coarse rye flour into dark, dense, sour loaves that could feed a household through a winter half a year long. To a stranger, it looked like a jar of spoiled batter someone forgot to throw out. At least that's what it looked like. What it actually was is one of the most sophisticated pieces of biological technology in the pre-industrial world, built from nothing but flour, water, and time. Today we show you how a pot of sour paste kept people alive for centuries, why it refused to spoil, how you can do it yourself, and why almost nobody bakes this way anymore. But this story doesn't start with the pot. It starts with the grain and with a simple problem of geography. Most of Russia is cold and a lot of it is poor ground. The growing season is short. Wheat, the grain that built the bread of southern and western Europe, struggles badly in that climate. It wants warmth, rich soil, and a long summer, and the Russian north reliably offers none of those things. Rye does not need them. Rye germinates in near-freezing soil. It shrugs off frost, drought, and acidity that would kill a wheat crop outright. Across the medieval period, from the northern forests down to the Baltic coast, rye became the grain of the ordinary person. Not by preference, but because it was the grain that actually came up out of the dirt year after year. If you were a peasant in this world, rye was not a choice. It was the deal nature offered you, and you took it. There was a problem, though. Rye does not behave like wheat in the oven. Wheat is loaded with gluten, the stretchy protein network that traps gas and gives you a light, airy loaf. Rye has almost none of that. Bake it the way you bake wheat, and you get a flat, gummy brick. To turn rye into something a person actually wants to eat, you cannot lean on the grain alone. You need acid, and you need fermentation. You need a living culture working in the dough for hours before it ever touches heat. That is exactly what the word describes. Zakvaska comes from an old Slavic root, kvasiti, meaning to ferment or to leaven. The same root gives us kvass, the fermented rye drink, and the everyday words for sour and for yeast. The admission is sitting right there inside the language. For these people, bread and fermentation were the same idea. You did not bake rye. You fermented it, and then you baked whatever the fermentation gave you. That dependence on fermentation is also where Russian bread parted ways with the sourdough the rest of Europe was making. In the wheat-growing south and west, from France down into northern Italy, bakers had a fallback. They could leaven a loaf with barm, the living foam skimmed off a vat of fermenting ale, and wheat's strong gluten and low enzyme content meant the bread would still rise into something light and tall. A sour culture there was one tool among several, kept mostly for flavour and a little extra lift. Rye gave the Russian baker no such options. Rye flour is packed with a heat-tolerant enzyme called amylase that keeps chewing through the loaf's own starch even as it bakes, and with rye's weak gluten there is nothing to hold the structure together. Skip the souring and the loaf slumps into a wet, gummy patty. The acid from a long fermentation is what shuts that enzyme down and lets the crumb set firm enough to slice. So the Zakvaska was load-bearing. It held the loaf together as much as it flavoured it. Lose your starter in a wheat town and you borrowed some barm from the brewer. lose it in a rye village, and there was nothing waiting to take its place. That is a large part of why these households guarded the pot the way they did. So what was actually living in that pot? For most of history, nobody knew. The bakers tending these cultures had no microscopes and no vocabulary for what they were doing. They knew only that a healthy starter smelled right, lifted the dough, and made bread that lasted, while a neglected one went slack and wrong and had to be thrown out. The knowledge was entirely practical, passed hand to hand, judged by smell and feel. And if you assume those people were just getting lucky, that's not the full picture. Modern science can finally name what they were protecting. A mature sourdough starter is a tiny ecosystem. Researchers have identified more than 50 species of lactic acid bacteria living in these cultures, most of them from the genus Lactobacillus, alongside more than 20 species of wild yeast, mostly from the genus Saccharomyces. The two groups do different jobs. The yeast eats sugar and gives off carbon dioxide, which lifts the dough. The bacteria produce acid, and one detail tends to surprise people. In a healthy starter, the bacteria massively outnumber the yeast. Analysis of mature cultures finds lactic acid bacteria beating yeast cells by something like 100 to 1. That ratio is the whole reason the bread keeps. As they feed, the lactobacilli pour out two acids. Lactic acid, which drops the pH and sours the dough, and acetic acid, the same compound that makes vinegar, which is a direct enemy of mold. Scientists who have measured it find sourdough bread sitting at a pH of roughly 3.8 to 4.6, while ordinary commercial yeast bread sits up around 5.3 to 5.8. That gap looks small written down. In practice, it is the difference between an environment where mold moves in within days and one where it can barely get a grip. Keeping the colony alive was the entire skill. The method has a modern name, backslopping, but the practice is ancient and simple. You never use all of your starter. You always hold a portion back, feed it fresh flour and water, and let it ferment again, which keeps the population of yeast and bacteria stable and well fed. In many Slavic households, the keeper went further still. A fist-sized piece of fermented dough from this week's baking was dried, wrapped in a clean cloth, and tucked into the dough trough. The next week it was soaked back to life and folded into the new batch. The culture never truly ended. It just paused and resumed, week after week, year after year. That habit of never letting the culture die completely was about to make the starter the most enduring thing a family owned. But that's getting ahead of the story. There's a reason this story is still told today. A Zakvaska was never really an ingredient. It was closer to an heirloom. Because the culture was continuous, a starter could descend through a family the way a name or a plot of land did. A daughter setting up her own household might carry a portion of her mother's starter with her, which meant the bread in her new kitchen tasted of the bread she grew up on. The microbes did not care about borders or generations. Fed and protected, they simply kept going. This turned bread into something shared at the level of the whole village. In farming households across the region, the keeper baked once or twice a week in big batches, because firing the oven was a major undertaking, not something you did for a single loaf. Neighbours who ran short before the next bake would borrow a loaf and repay it with one of their own the following week. Bread moved around the community like a small informal currency, and it all traced back to the handful of living cultures that a few households kept alive. You can hear how deep this ran in the culture itself. Russian hospitality is still summed up in two words: chleb sol, bread and salt, the gift offered to an honoured guest at the door. In the old folk tales, the great masonry oven in the corner of the hut is practically a character, handing rye pies to lost children and hiding them from danger. There is even a military legend, impossible to fully confirm, that during a war in the 18th century, Russian troops nearly fell apart when their supply of sour rye bread was cut off and they were handed plain unleavened wheat instead. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the fact that the story was worth telling says plenty. To these people, sour rye bread was not a side dish. It was the floor under their entire diet, and the bakers keeping it going had no idea, in any scientific sense, what they were defending. Everything was in place. They just didn't have the words for what they'd built. If keeping a culture like that alive sounds like something you'd actually want to try, I pulled everything I've learned about it into the Medieval Way store. The sourdough manual walks you through building and feeding a rye starter the traditional way. The practical recipes book turns that starter into real loaves you can put on the table. And the sourcing guide helps you track down proper grain to do it with. All three are linked in the description. Now back to the oven. The same sour culture that made coarse rye worth eating was also the thing keeping that bread from rotting. And the part that still surprises people is just how many separate defences were running at once. The first is the acid itself. By the time a long rye fermentation finishes, the lactic and acetic acid have pulled the dough down into that low pH range, and most of the organisms that rot bread simply cannot function in that much acid. The sourness you taste is the preservative doing its job. You are tasting the loaf defend itself. The second is competition, and this is the part that gets overlooked. A mature starter is not just acidic, it is crowded. 50+ strains of bacteria and 20-odd yeasts, all established, all feeding, leave almost no room for an outsider to gain a foothold. When a stray mold spore or a spoilage bacterium lands in that environment, it arrives to find every seat taken and the air too acidic to breathe. On top of that, many lactic acid bacteria secrete their own antimicrobial compounds, including small proteins called bacteriocins that actively suppress rival microbes. The culture doesn't just outvote the competition, it poisons it. The third defense is the oven, and in Russia that meant a very specific machine. The Russian masonry oven, the Russkaya pech, appeared in its developed form around the 15th century and became the heart of the peasant home. These things were enormous. A single oven could swallow a quarter of the floor space of the hut and weigh 1 to 2 tons, built of brick and clay, threaded with internal flues that trapped heat and let it out slowly. 2 tons. That's not a typo. You lit it maybe twice a day, and once the fire burned down and the ashes were swept aside, you had a thick-walled stone chamber holding a deep, steady, falling heat for hours. That is close to perfect for rye. A dense rye loaf does not want a fast, fierce bake. It wants long, gentle, even heat that drives moisture into the crumb and finishes the chemistry the fermentation started. The oven was a slow cooker built into the wall of the house. There was a fourth benefit the bakers could never have measured, though their bodies registered it. Whole rye contains a compound called phytic acid, which locks up minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium so the gut cannot absorb them. A quick risen loaf keeps most of that phytic acid intact, but a long sourdough fermentation, the kind these cultures forced on the dough over many hours, switches on enzymes that break the phytic acid down and release those minerals. The same slow process that preserved the bread also unlocked its nutrition. A family living on sour rye through the winter wasn't just being kept full, they were being kept fed, in the real sense, with iron and minerals their bodies could actually use. Put it together, and you can see the system these households were running without ever drawing the diagram. Acid to kill the rot, a crowded culture to crowd out invaders, a slow stone oven to bake it through, and a long ferment that quietly improved the food while it preserved it. 4 mechanisms, 1 pot of grey paste, and not a single ingredient a peasant couldn't find within walking distance of home. You'd think someone would have written all this down as the marvel it was. Nobody did, because to them it wasn't a marvel. It was just Tuesday. So let's say you want to keep one of these alive yourself. The good news is that the barrier was never knowledge or equipment, it was patience. You can start a Zakvaska in your own kitchen with 2 ingredients and about a week of attention. Begin with whole grain rye flour. The darker and coarser the better, because the wild yeast and bacteria you need are already living on the grain. Mix a few spoonfuls of rye flour with an equal amount of room temperature water in a clean jar until it looks like thick batter. Cover it loosely so it can breathe and set it somewhere warm. The next day, it may look like nothing has happened. That's normal. Each day you feed it. Pour off about half of what's in the jar, then stir in another fresh spoonful or 2 of rye flour and the same amount of water. This is the backslopping the old keepers did, just on a kitchen counter instead of in a dough trough. Within a few days you'll see bubbles and catch that sharp, sour, slightly fruity smell. Within a week or so you'll have an active culture that doubles in size after every feeding. That's your Zakvaska. It is alive, and from here on it eats on a schedule. To bake with it, stir a portion into a dough of rye flour, water and salt, then give it time. Not 2 hours. Closer to a full day of slow fermentation in a cool kitchen is what develops the acid, the flavour and the keeping power. Then bake it low and long. You don't have a 2-ton brick oven, but you can imitate one. A heavy lidded pot, a covered loaf pan, a baking stone, anything with thermal mass that holds steady heat will push you toward the deep, even bake rye once. What comes out will be dark, dense, faintly sweet and sour in exactly the way the grain intended. Hold a portion back every time, keep feeding it, and that same culture will still be working months from now. Stored cool and fed regularly, a Zakvaska does not really have an expiration date. People have carried single cultures across decades, and there is no scientific reason a well-tended one cannot outlive the person who started it. You are not buying a product. You are adopting a colony, and your only real job is to keep feeding it. Go back to that pot near the oven, the one the woman fed before she did anything else with her day. It looked like spoiled batter. It was actually the most reliable machine in the house, a colony of living things she guarded because her family's survival ran straight through it. The reason cultures like hers eventually went quiet is simple. Speed. A bakery that needs a day to ferment and a day to bake cannot compete with a factory that turns out 1,000 loaves before lunch. So the cultures faded, the dried scraps of dough got tossed, and most of us forgot that bread was ever something you kept alive instead of something you bought off a shelf. If this is the kind of buried knowledge you want more of, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig up the techniques that kept people alive when there was no safety net underneath them. And tell us in the comments, would you keep a culture like this going in your own kitchen, or has bread just gotten too easy to bother with? Until next time, stay curious.